when you actually look at behavior, observable behavior of, different generations. So they say that they want to align with, sustainable brands and brands that are really driving equity and inclusion. Yet when you watch behavior, they're, and I'm not saying every Gen Zer, but they're buying from Shein and Forever 21, and they're not very sustainable in that regard. So it's just interesting dichotomy of how we want transparency, we talk about transparency, yet our actions as consumers and also brands in many cases don't exemplify that behavior.
Welcome everyone to another Trust Factor podcast. I'm really excited today to have a conversation around moving beyond authenticity. Everyone talks about authenticity, but it's overused. But what's the playbook to really build trust with brands as our authentic self as organizations? And joining me today is Michael Brito. And Michael, welcome, and excited to have you here. Michael is the head of global analytics at the Zeno Group. He's also an adjunct professor at San Jose State University. He's also a TEDx speaker. Michael's also recognized by PR Week as one of the 25 most influential people in the communications technology class. He's also identified as one of the top 25 digital innovators by Provoke Media. And he's also been published in a variety of different books, including Smart Business, Your Brand, and Participation Marketing. And so, Michael, welcome.
Thank you.
And, you've been advising brands for decades on authenticity and how to build more trust. So I'm really excited to have this conversation about kind of how companies have historically run this playbook, what they're currently doing, and where we think this is all going, because the world is also changing so rapidly, and the art of building trust is becoming more and more nuanced. So excited to have you here, and
Thank you.
Excited for the conversation.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the introduction, and it's interesting because when you were talking, I was just having a vision of reading reports over the last several years about Gen Z and how every survey, every report that you've read, shows that Gen Z, that generation, wants to buy from brands that have similar values, and yet the verbal acceptance or the going through a survey and then the actual actions are very different when you actually look at behavior, observable behavior of different generations. So they say that they want to align with sustainable brands and brands that are really driving equity and inclusion. Yet when you watch behavior, they're and I'm not saying every Gen Zer, but they're buying from Shein and Forever 21, and they're not very sustainable in that regard. So it's just interesting dichotomy of how we want transparency, we talk about transparency, yet our actions as consumers and also brands in many cases don't exemplify that behavior.
Yeah. So that's an interesting perspective, and maybe kind of the opening kind of part of our conversation I'd like to start with is really around even the word authenticity, because I feel like it's become a bit cliche. Like, people will, I've seen corporate leaders on my LinkedIn feed be authentic, talking about, they saw their daughter perform, in a soccer match, and that's like their version of being authentic, like sharing something about them personally. But also every brand claims it to be authentic, but most fail to live it. And so in today's culture of skepticism, authenticity, I feel, is no longer enough. Trust must be earned, proven, and sustained. And I'm curious, do you have examples of companies that are getting it right? Like, I'm curious, like, what's an example of a company out there that's really getting it right in terms of building trust through their authentic selves?
I mean, yes. I mean, Cracker Barrel. I mean, that just came out in the news recently, right? Where they had, they went through this entire rebrand, and they thought what they were doing was being transparent, and they were actually taking action, and they went through a whole creative refresh of their business. And the community, their customers, there was a huge backlash from not just your general consumer, but even like Hollywood actors and people who had traditionally gone to Cracker Barrel. And honestly, I've never been to one, so I have no idea what people are talking about. There aren't any in the Bay Area that I know of. So
I've driven past a couple as I've driven through the Midwest, but I haven't been to one either.
Okay. So what did they do? They just basically said, okay, they just completely disregarded this entire brand campaign that they probably spent millions of dollars. Now, whether or not you agree with it, I mean, to me, that's being transparent and being authentic, right? They tried to go in a direction that their customers didn't necessarily want them to go in. So they said, okay, you know what? We hear you. We're going to kind of go back and to the way we were, to that kind of traditional, look, feel, and messaging. And so that's probably the most recent example, which was like a week ago, maybe 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
But you're right. A lot of brands do say that they're being authentic and transparent. Yet you see things in the news where, I'm not going to call anyone out specifically, but the CEO who was on the cam, right, was it the hockey game, and having an extramarital affair, right? And he's not the brand, but he is, right? He's the leader of a brand. And so I think it's just interesting, just with the polarization of today and politics and the society that we live in, where everything is online, and the internet could be very, very ruthless in judging behavior and character. I think brands just need to be careful, and being authentic means having integrity, and if you're having an affair outside of your marriage, then that's not really on a brand per se, but still, as the leader, you need to just be smart about what you're not. I'm not judging, that what he was doing or what he wasn't, but it's just an interesting dichotomy, another layer of risk that brands need to manage through. Yeah.
Well, casting a public light on your extramarital affair is always a bad look, I think, in every decade. That's probably a golden rule. As from a MAHA perspective, the way we think about authenticity is looking at corporate actions via their disclosures. And so what is the track record of what a company actually executes on? And it's not just their social and environmental, but their leadership, their ethics, their innovation. I think the way we try to advise our clients and help our clients is to really help them understand how they're actually performing relative to their industry. And from there, help them understand how that perception can be changed based upon either better articulating what they're executing on, or reallocating resources through a fact-based process of looking at where they're being left behind and where they need to evolve more effectively relative to their competition. And it's interesting, I feel, that in today's world, where values are changing so rapidly, and commitments are being made and then walked back. 5 years ago, we were talking about the Great Resignation, and now, it appears that, leaders don't care as much about, their employees, or, the automotive industry. Everyone was falling over each other, focusing on EVs and electrification. And now all of a sudden people are walking that back. I'm curious, how do you, think about that, and how do you advise clients to make moves, whether it's pulling back policy or communicating in areas? How have you historically done that, and how do you think that your counsel and approach is changing as the world is changing so quickly?
I think it's interesting because, working at an integrated communications firm, we're dealing with reputation, awareness, engagement, not necessarily, we're not tracking or managing sales. I mean, clients understand that in this particular field of PR is not necessarily, the sales really isn't a metric. Although, the last maybe 15 years or so, I've seen, a lot of PR teams have to account for and try to show some type of financial metric that what they're doing on the PR side is actually working. So driving impact, or the CMO may say, well, justify spending $30,000 a month on a PR firm, or justify these 2 new hires. Like what's the ROI in that? So that is becoming a conversation more so now than it has been in the past. But the reason why I say that is because, when you're giving counsel to a client and you're not necessarily responsible for driving sales, what are the other factors, right?
Yeah.
What are the other stakeholders in a brand's or in a business's line of sight that matter, that aren't necessarily buying from you? And so I think that, for me, the ultimate test case, you brought up, these automobile manufacturers who are pulling back on EVs. The question I would say is, well, why? Is it our revenues? Is it sales? Are sales declining? Are the margins too small? And so that would be a question I would have, because if they're selling products and they're driving revenue, then I'm not sure that would be a reason to do that. And I'm curious if any of the research that you found, like, what are the reasons why that brands are kind of holding back on the EV on the EV side?
Yeah. So I think that, and so we work within that industry and have clients, and I think that what we've seen is that the biggest reason for the pullback ultimately is the cost analysis, the ability to tool up. And whether it's gigafactories and or just tooling for new production lines is expensive. And I think that the economy, the global economy, is in a place where people are taking more of a defensive posture than playing offense these days. There's also been, I think, consumer sentiments, especially in the U.S., around going back towards gas and hybrid. And so I think that a lot of it is based upon, just the cost implications and the investment required to be able to execute on those commitments. I think, though, that, some companies are doing really interesting things, like, for example, Honda is partnering with Sony, and they're rolling out
I saw that.
Tequila, which is basically like a rolling DJ sort of. It's super cool. Actually, there was I saw one here at a car show. So I think some companies are leaning into partnering or white labeling other manufacturers' vehicles to continue to execute on those commitments. And others are pulling back simply because that they're really looking at Wall Street, and they're looking at investor sentiment, and they're trying to, show profitability and growth, profitability over growth, actually. So I think but again, as it relates to our conversation here on authenticity, I think it's one of those things where, and I'm curious what you think about this, because you mentioned Gen Z earlier. What I find is the danger in if companies pull back on commitments on an ongoing basis, they run the risk of their stakeholders really not knowing what they stand for at all. And so if you make a commitment, do you think that rolling that commitment back, if you do it once or twice, it's fine. But if you're continuously doing that, what are the implications to a brand around doing that, whether it's their electrification, whether it's their DEI, whether it's their employee policies? I mean, what is the implication to all that? Is there an implication?
Yeah, it's hard to say, because we've seen it since, I would say, more so right during the pandemic and, George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, when you had a lot of these brands who were saying, we support DE&I. And they would get called. I would see this all the time on X or wherever, where certain individuals would go to the board of directors and say, okay, well, you believe in diversity, but your board, everyone on your board they're white males in their 50s, right?
Yeah.
So, so they're being called out, and they have been. I've seen that time and time again. And so, and that's the risk you run of being vocal and transparent, is being called out on the action, right?
Yeah.
So, and it goes back to what, your introduction, which is we talk a lot about it, but there's not a lot of action behind it. And in a world where the internet is not forgiving and will pull up tweets from 25 years ago, that is a risk that brands have. And so, that is ultimately, I mean, we could talk about the brands over the last 5 years who have been canceled or have been boycotted for a variety of reasons. And I think it does go back to authenticity and transparency, and the action or inaction that they have been called out for. And so that's, I guess, and we'll see, right? I don't know, like Target's another great example, right? There have been boycotts from the left and boycotts on the right, from the right. I have not looked at their financial statements recently. I don't know how well they're doing or how their stock price is doing. So,
Terrible.
Is it terrible? Okay.
Yeah.
And I think that's a great example of, in political terms, flip-flopping, right? They went one way, then they went another way. Then but do I go to Target every day? Yes, because it's convenient. It's close to my house. And so, I don't know what Target stands for. And honestly, and I'm a Gen Xer, so personally, I don't care. I mean, that's just in my life and in my circumstances. I go where there's convenience, where there's cost savings, where there's good products. And, and I only know that they're flip-flopping because that's the world that I live in. But we also live in a silo, you and I and people who we interact with on daily basis. Do general consumers actually walk in and out of Target to say, I wonder what Target stands for? Who are they and what do they stand for and why should I care? And I don't think that they do that. Now, they are reading the news and they're seeing, positive and negative news. So that's a hard question to answer. I don't know what the right answer is. Yeah. I think reflection, now and looking at the brands who've been going through things, and seeing where they are today, is a good baseline and benchmark to mitigate risk for future decisions that you make or don't make.
This is an interesting example because we actually had a client ask us to do some analysis in this particular area across Target and their competitors. So Costco and Walmart and all their competitors. And what we found to be really interesting was that the companies in that industry that had poor DEI performance, when they pulled back their DEI commitments, it had no effect on their reputation or really their business in any way. In fact, they were more authentic because they weren't performing on it. Yeah. So canceling it didn't really matter. What was interesting, though, was the two cohorts, Costco and Target, were the two that were performing really well on DEI. And Target pulled back, alienating a lot of its customer base, and Costco held firm. And actually, Costco took a lot of revenue from Target, and that was, again, I mean, you were talking about trust and authenticity and revenue. There's a great example of how a company made a move that actually had an effect. I mean, there were other reasons, not just this, but this was a major contributing factor to a substantial reduction in traffic to their website, revenue, and ultimately it contributed to the loss of the CEO losing his job because of this. And so my takeaway from that analysis was that the herd mentality is dangerous. And just because everyone's doing it doesn't mean you should do it. And I think that there is now data available to be able to show which companies, what are their differentiating drivers. And if it is differentiating, if you're leading the market in certain areas, it might be an opportunity to own it and demonstrate that you're not willing to just go with what everyone else is doing, but go with what you're committed to. And it doesn't have to be political. It can be around innovation. It can be around how you're showing up in your communities. It can be around access that you're providing and affordability. But there are hundreds of factors that go into building an authentic brand and building trust. And I think that, the good news is I think there's more and more data. We certainly believe there is to be able to tease that signal out and to make decisions off of it. But again, that's an example, a really interesting one of how trust and authenticity led to a loss in revenue.
It's interesting because when you look at the data, different types of data, so not necessarily disclosures, but when you look at like data around the talking heads, right, and the ones who are very opinionated and publishing a lot of content on both, sides of the political spectrum and everywhere in between, you would think that it's like the end of the world. Whether it's a boycott, I remember when Target was being boycott, there was a boycott around the transgender clothing line. And, there were a couple, of those on the right that had videos of people upset and, really upset about it and posting on TikTok, things like that. And I think that a lot of times consumers, we kind of live in a bubble and we live in the algorithm, right? Because we're watching a YouTube video or a TikTok, or an X, and because we're watching it, we get inundated with similar content. So in our mind, oh my God, this is like, and if I'm a brand and I'm looking at social listening or, I'm seeing all these mentions about boycotting brand A, boycotting brand B, you would essentially think, again, it's okay, we're going out of business. We need to make some, and I think a lot of executives and leaders see that, and that is just like one data point that they're using to shift business strategy. Now, maybe I'm over exaggerating a little bit, but I do think that happens a lot of times where you look at one tweet, right? One person who is driving a boycott of a brand, and he has 5 million followers and he tweets about your company, and all of a sudden you're like in panic mode, right? And you have to change things. And I think that as much as we live in an agile world and things happen quickly, there's more context that needs to be looked at and had before changing your entire business strategy. So the Cracker Barrel one's an interesting one because I don't think that was necessarily political, although I did see a lot of political kind of leaning conversation there. But I just want to call that out because data is important, and that's the world that I live in as well. And so I'm always setting the caveat that look, this is an ecosystem, right? This is of people who are an echo chamber, right? And so let's not make too drastic of decisions right this second. At the same time, we need to be agile and need to flex quickly if we need to. So that's always a caveat I like to, communicate to clients about situations like this.
Yeah. So let's get practical about this. So, as the global head of analytics at Zeno Group, one of the largest, PR and strategic communications companies in the world, how should comms and marketing teams how should they audit their narratives and search for credibility and influence and more influence? How do you do that today? How do you help them, and what's changed in that process?
Well, I think you answered the question initially with what you said, in that marketing and PR, very rarely are they connecting internally. There's not a lot of collaboration between a lot of brands, and I think that's why they get into trouble because marketing. And I come from a direct marketing back. I mean, early in my career, as direct marketing, and so I understand. They're risk takers, right? You want to drive sales. You have a new product you want to launch, so we're going to partner with these creators. We're going to do this. We're going to have this TV spot, and oftentimes they don't look at it through the lens of risk and reputation, I think. And that's what PR does, right? PR is like, they're the grumpy people, right? They're like, hey, hold up, let's not approve this yet. Let's make sure that we're crossing all the dots here, or crossing all the T's and dotting all the I's, and making sure that whatever we're going to market with doesn't necessarily is aligned with our messaging, number one, but number two, it doesn't offend a stakeholder, or it doesn't offending isn't the right word, but it's smart, right? And so there's this balance internally of, okay, sales, revenue, pipeline, go to market, and then you have PR back here saying, oh, hold up, you're moving too fast. We need to, or they're not communicating at all.
Yeah.
And then something happens, and then there's discourse and there's boycotts happening. So I think that's number one, is marketing and PR need to communicate. It sounds easy, but it's not that easy internally. There's legacy org structures where, CMOs and CCOs, or if it's maybe just a CMO and the head of comms reports into the CCO, and then, so there's this interesting land grab of decision making. And that's real, and it has been real since the beginning of business. That's what my first book's about, actually. Smart business, social business. Yeah, kind of. And so that's number one. Number two is like, we from a narrative standpoint, we a lot of brands will put out material, campaigns, press releases, content, executive content. And, when you look at it and you do an analysis on it, you can very easily tell what their narrative is, what core messaging they are putting in the marketplace. When you look at earned media and do the same analysis and say, okay, well, what's pulling through? If brand A is pushing 4 messages around, one being sustainability and innovation and user experience and whatever, like what is the reaction of earned media? So what are the messages that earned media is pulling through? 9 times out of 10, they don't match up. There might be 1 or 2 that match up in terms of messaging, but that's expected because the media isn't going to just repeat your brand narrative, right? You're going to pitch them stories. You're going to have, and they're going to interpret it and articulate it their way. But then you have the social discourse, right, about the brand, and is it aligned with the narrative? And now with the rise of like GEO, what are the large language models and their interpretation of your brand narrative? So there's all these other layers of narratives, and 9 times out of 10, they don't always align with what you as a brand owner are putting out in the marketplace. So I think it's important to analyze not just sentiment. I mean, sentiment is part of it, but the messaging, the core pillars of social discourse, of earned media, of even breaking it down between business media and trade media and consumer lifestyle media, right? Each of those have business and investor media. Exactly. The Barron's and, Financial Times. And then lastly, just the large language models too. It's a big thing that's top of mind for clients right now, which is, why now we have to measure the sentiment of a machine, and they all are contextualizing our brand differently. ChatGPT versus Perplexity. So that's just another layer of complexity that brands need to think about and invest in to be smarter about. Do they need to audit their narrative? Do they need to shift their messaging, or do they need to figure out ways where they need to break through? Yeah. And that of certain media outlets or whatever the end game is.
You talked a couple of minutes ago about the siloed organization between PR and marketing. I would take it a step further and say that trust is an enterprise level function, and it's interesting that trust and this conversation we're having historically, I feel, has sat in the PR comms world, and it's been their responsibility, reputation. But what's been interesting for us is over the last couple of years, as the world has become a little bit more frenetic, how the buyers of our technology have started parsing out to other functions in the organization. We've had a lot of sustainability, risk management, investor relations folks come to us, and I think that is that's symptomatic of a shift going on in the marketplace around that these drivers of trust are enterprise wide and needed at enterprise level. I mean, it's interesting. You look at most 10K reports, and they identify all sorts of different risk factors, right? They talk about currency risk and foreign exchange risk and tariff risk, and they quantify that stuff. But when they talk about reputation or trust, they name it as a risk with no quantification. And I think that is interesting. And I think that increasingly an area where there's going to be further quantification for sure, but also consumption across the enterprise, because I think gone are the days where you call your PR team and say, we got a problem. How are we going to spin our way out of this thing? And it has to become more proactive, and it has to become more integrated across the enterprise. And so I think we're seeing that. And in fact, even the comms folks that we work with, they're now sharing the platform with other functions. But interestingly, we're getting sustainability folks buy our platform and then start integrating the comms team in. So it's going the other way. Because they're trying to demonstrate the business case for continuing to invest in the sustainability initiatives of the company and use it as a strategic planning tool, an evidence-based strategic planning tool, and then bring the comms folks to be able to control that narrative more effectively. Like in automotive is a great example of that. Like, they don't want to communicate or they want to defend EV investment, not because they want to save the world, but because they feel that it's a business imperative and that they're going to get left behind. And so they want to understand the business case for that and then work with comms to control that narrative. And so I think that is even in the last couple of years, I've seen that shift. I don't know if you've seen a similar kind of shift happening.
It's funny. You said that trust should be a function internally. I'm not an organizational development expert or change management expert at all, but I thought you were going to say that trust should be like a core value internally, because, and maybe that's part of it too, because if it's a function, it should be a core value, but it's almost like because.
Well, I'm actually saying it's cross-function. I think it's just it's kind of like in the 90s, and we're both old. We can remember this in the 90s. There was this total quality management.
Oh, TQM, yes.
Right? Remember that? And it was one of those things where all of a sudden it was like, yeah, it's not just the QA department. Everyone needs to own quality. And I think I feel like it's the same thing here.
It is.
Everyone needs to own trust. It's not relegated to one department, but they need a common framework to be able to work with each other.
Yeah. So I think I have seen instances where, our clients or PR in general is getting pulled into something that another group is kind of driving as it relates to reputation. Sometimes it's like a customer success team, right? If they're hearing negative feedback, or, maybe even a sales team, if they're getting pushback when they're trying to close deals about potential clients, not being happy with something that's related to the brand or business or product. But I think you're right. Yeah. It's like, because it kind of goes two ways. Trust is, if I'm running comms internally or marketing internally, I'm going to need to collaborate and trust others in my organization and get them involved early, right? Before I launch a campaign or before I sign a deal with a particular actor or, talent, which, so I think it's something that should be looked at more and brands should really think through, because if you look at some of the brands who've gone through a lot of turmoil and the different news cycles, and their valuation right today, their sales today, you mentioned Target earlier, you need to have that conversation earlier. And I think it's a larger, it's not just PR, it's not just marketing, it's stakeholders internally that are decision makers and maybe even investors in some cases.
Yeah. A kind of a follow on to all this is that, of course, scenarios change and resources get reallocated, and that's happening all the time. So how do you advise clients who want to do some scenario planning and are deciding to end of life a product or sunset a policy? How do you advise them around how they should communicate and control the narrative when they have to pivot? Like we talked about EVs as an example. Like if they're going to sunset an EV program or the DEI program, or whatever it might be. How do you advise them on that? And what are good examples of how to do that?
Yeah. Well, I think that I'm not on the crisis team. I don't lead crisis as part of my function. I have colleagues where are much smarter than I, who in this space are having those conversations with clients. And they are, crisis and scenario planning is an offering, right? I think most PR firms do have that for clients. I get usually brought into the conversation when it's about measurement and, using data to uncover blind spots or hidden insights, things like that.
How do you work with them using data?
Yeah, it depends on the ask, but we are looking at, we're not looking at disclosures yet. I'm hoping that will change, but the data that we do have access to, right, which is consumer sentiment data, primary, secondary research, social listening data, performance data of what they're doing in the market or not. And so it's and I have my perspective on it, and it's always a different, I may look at something in one way, the crisis team might look at it a different way, but ultimately they're the subject matter experts in communicating directly to clients. So scenario planning is very big, and I think that brands that don't do that, I think it's a big miss, because those are the ones that are not prepared and not able to handle discourse, or even more so, make too fragile of a business decision without getting the full context and understanding of the potential implications. And so I don't think I answered your question fully, only because I'm a lot of times I'm not in those meetings. They're happening and we drive them, but I'm not usually the one communicating directly with the client on what they should be doing. But scenario planning is huge. And I think
are you seeing that certain industries there's a higher take rate on that in certain industries than others right now? Or now?
If you think, with the current administration, with, food and bev is high touch, lots of conversation with the red dye ban and things like that. So I think food and bev is a big one. I haven't had much kind of conversation in the automobile kind of sector, but definitely, CPG, the food and bev, not really tech, industry that I'm seeing. There are other issues in tech that I think there was a recent announcement with Salesforce. They're laying off 5,000 people. This was just yesterday or the day, or maybe Friday, for AI. So there's this interest, that's a different scenario plan, right? That's a different kind of planning, but it's still trust and authenticity and transparency, right? There's still that as part of that announcement and business decision. So we'll see how that goes with them. But
yeah. So I guess this is a fascinating conversation. I guess in closing, I'm really interested in, you've been in this industry for so long and you've been a thought leader for so long in this industry. Where does this head? Like where do you see this trust building and AI and advanced LLMs? Like where do you see this head? In the next few years, as it relates to, will organizations become more integrative with this? Number one. Number two, do you think that they'll be able to connect this to business outcomes like revenue? I'm curious, like, where does this all go?
I don't know, maybe Cyberdyne. I don't know if you remember Terminator or Cyberdyne. That was the company, right? That had the AI. I'm more of a, I think it's going to help in the long run. I honestly don't know. I feel like it's, there are so many factors to consider, and this could be another episode, I think, for your podcast, because it can go in so many different directions. I think it's already changing just over the last 6 months in organizational structure, in even data, and but I think underscoring all of that in terms of reputation and trust, I think being able to use predictive analytics to identify different triggers and levers that you can pull or check that would then point to a particular outcome, whether it be a sales outcome or a increase in NPS or increase in sales or whatever the outcome is. I think that prediction, there's already a little bit of that happening, and I think there's a lot happening even in your platform. But even just little, hiring executives or launching new products or cutting in certain areas or investing in new areas. I think with AI and hopefully integration internally between marketing, comms, and research teams, et cetera, I think predictive analytics is one where it'll be more streamlined. And you're not going to need a data scientist to do it, right? It's going to be just part of a chat, right? Where you can, ask questions about decisions, and it's going to be a very strategic counselor for you. I don't know how that's going to look on the back end. I'm just, not being an engineer either. So, I don't really know, but it's fascinating that you and I have been on the forefront of a lot of changes in the last 30, 40 years with the internet, Web 2.0, Web 3.0, and even just social media, and being here in the AI side is just another cycle of innovation that I'm just happy to be a part of. Yeah,
for sure. And I think that, just like the, internet, the first boom and then 2.0 and 3.0, it wasn't the big technology infrastructure or in this case, these, massive LLM models, whether it's, Claude or ChatGPT. I think that where the real shift happens is when there's the niche kind of wrapper that comes around those, builds on top of those LLMs that can really drive value in particular industries or in particular verticals. And so I think that, I think in this vertical that we're talking about, I think it's interesting because now you have access to all that data, but you can now also leverage that data in ways that can support a workflow in ways that you couldn't before. At the risk of maybe leaking something I shouldn't be right now, so my chief science officer might get upset at me for this, but we brought a bunch of PhDs together and actually went back a decade and looked at data, public disclosure data, sentiment analysis going back 10 years to look and see, was there a causal link between revenue and changes in reputation? Because everyone kind of has felt that is there, and I'm not going to give away the punchline yet. I'll wait for that peer-reviewed article to come out. The one thing that I will tease that I think is really interesting is that where the causal link showed brightest and strongest was in B2C brands and B2C companies, and that makes sense, right?
Yeah,
that makes sense. Because that Gen Z vibe is right in there, and so that's interesting, right? And so, what are the implications of that, and what does that mean? So, but I'll close this by saying I appreciate you saying that this is kind of maybe part one of our podcast, because I'd love, because our organizations are beginning to work together now, and I'm excited about that. But I'd love to do a phase 2 of this where we actually bring a client on to have a more in-depth conversation about the journey of an actual brand on this road, because I think it's an exciting time. I think it's an exciting time to actually build more trust and build more enterprise value as a result of that. And I think there are already companies that are getting that very right, like a Costco. They've done tremendous, and I think there will just be more opportunities for that. And look forward to being in the work with you and supporting this market on that journey.
It's a great conversation. Thank you. And I'm excited to read that peer review article. So let me know when it's published.
I will. All right, Michael. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
This is a great conversation.